There's tough competition for the title of most out-of-touch member of Britain's Tory cabinet, but Jacob Rees-Mogg is definitely up there. He recently called the PartyGate scandal fluff and fundamentally trivial, and he's now defended those comments on LBC.
But I would reiterate that is not as significant as what is going on in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis.
But for someone such as Chris, respectfully, Mr. Rees-Mogg, and for some of my listeners who bade farewell to their loved ones as they got in ambulances, never to see them again, who went to hospital wards and were not permitted on there due to COVID, to hear that at that very time there were parties going on with
They are understandably cross about this.
It's a visceral feeling.
They are understandably cross about this.
Which they don't see, Mr. Rees-Mogg, as quotes fluff or quotes fundamentally trivial.
But I think we have to think about, in the inquiry, whether this level of rule was right. We need to get to what was the fundamental issue.
But that doesn't help someone saying goodbye to Grandad.
I agree with that. But what we should learn from this is not in relation to parties, but was it ever right to say that you weren't allowed to be with people as they were dying? And I think it's so important that the inquiry that is going to take place looks into whether the restrictions were proportionate. Because actually, I think that you remember the picture from a funeral where an official came along and said that I think it was a son shouldn't be near.
The son was taken from his mum.
Yes. This was not something that should ever have happened, in my view. That element of rule enforcement, of approach to rules, was simply unkind and inhuman.
But you're almost arguing against yourself, because if that son and that widow encountered that level of grief, to hear a senior politician describe it, quote, as fluff and fundamentally trivial, that's sickening to them, Mr. Rees-Mogg. I ask you once again to review those words.
No, I think those words, in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, are completely reasonable. I don't think the issue of what may or may not have happened in Downing Street and what we are now finding out is fundamental. What I think is fundamental is that we look in the inquiry at how the rules were devised and the effect that they had, because I think some of those rules were inhuman.
So when we show these clips about Partygate, sometimes they can feel familiar. And there was one argument he made there, which we've talked about a lot, which is Conservatives standing up and saying, well, actually, they maybe broke the rules, but the rules were the problem anyway. Now, obviously, that's incredibly offensive because we all had to follow those rules. People who didn't follow the rules got fined. So you can't get found out that you broke them and then say, oh, actually, the rules were the problem when you made them. I think we've covered that a lot already on this show. This new excuse, though, which Jacob Rees-Mogg mentioned there, and which I find kind of just as offensive, if not more, is to say, oh, yeah, maybe it was bad, but, there are worse things going on in the world, such as the cost of living crisis, which, to be honest, is your fault, and the war in Ukraine, right? Now, on one level, maybe that makes sense, but it makes as much sense as me saying, oh, sorry, I cheated with your husband, but there's a war in Ukraine, so stop talking about it. Sorry, I stole your laptop, but there's a cost of living crisis, so why don't we just talk about more important things? Those things have nothing to do with each other, and you have to take responsibility for the thing that is your fault. You can't say, oh, I've done this bad thing, but there's a worse thing going on somewhere else in the world. That's not how adults should make arguments. It's maybe how very small children should make arguments, but it's not how adults should make arguments, and especially not our political leaders. Aaron, what did you make of that interview?
This isn't a big deal because actually the laws that we imposed as the government were stupid and they shouldn't have been adhered to anyway. This doesn't fly in any other media environment in Europe except Britain's, and it's not vomited out of the mouth of any politician except the likes of somebody like Rees-Mogg. And the thing is, some people will buy it. Some people are like, yeah, it was a bit OTT, wasn't it? We were all carried up in the moment. You were the government. I find this a very strange defence. There was one gentleman from Tottenham who received a £2,200 fine for not having a good enough reason to be out. And he was in a car with somebody else not wearing a mask, and they got a £2,200 fine. There's people like that up and down the country, right? That's not a party. That wasn't a super spreader event, who were fined for doing things like that. And actually they were guilty of nothing compared to what we saw repeatedly at Number 10 Downing Street and elsewhere amongst the Tory party, various soirees and get-togethers and quizzes and booze-ups. But that was nothing. And so I think if Rees-Mogg is going to be consistent here and say, well, actually, the law was wrong, we shouldn't be too harsh on those who broke it, that if we're being fair, that should therefore cover tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who've been hit in their back pocket. And like you say, it's very strange for him to say, oh, well, compared to the cost of living crisis, this is really a small fry. Well, the guy who had to pay a £2,000 fine and now is seeing his energy bill double, you shafted him on both counts. So it's a very, very strange defense. But then Rees-Mogg specializes in absurd defenses, which seem to cut through. We live in a media environment now in Britain where the truth is so meaningless. I don't mean that like post-truth, the facts matter, because we've always had politicians who like to dissemble and deceive. My God, look at the Iraq War. But I don't think anybody sort of wore that and presented that as gleefully as Jacob Rees-Mogg. Tony Blair always liked to say, I'm an honest person. He liked to have a semblance of intellectual coherence in what he said, whereas Rees-Mogg just sort of flies from one crazy position to the other in real time, and you're watching it and you think, wow, this guy's a senior lawmaker for the party of government. He's not some, eccentric backbencher who nobody listens to, which is what he should be. No, he's one of the people in charge. He's an avatar of the Conservative government in 2022. Deeply concerning. But I sort of find the response from Nick Ferrari also very strange. I mean, this should be a moment of almost mockery for him, and yet he's sort of saying, well, have you considered the counterpoint? And they're two cheeks of the same arse, and they're both part of the problem. Nick Ferrari and Jacob Rees-Mogg.
It's true. If you value yourself on being a really tough interviewer, he shouldn't have been able to leave that room like not having been completely humiliated. So I do think Nick Ferrari definitely, well, you can call it a failure, or you can call it that he lets right wing.